George of the jungle, strong as he can be.
Okay, so exactly how do you go about getting somebody out of the home that they picked, put down 10%, and have an equitable interest in the home? That's what we're going to be talking about in thecreditjungle.com today. My name is George Anderson, and I have invited Jax Pettey, who is a personal friend, an excellent real estate attorney, and the president of First Liberty Title, to come and join us and talk a little bit about this forfeiture process on the contract for deed. Jax, come on up. And I'm just going to turn the time over to Jax here and just take it away and explain how we get these people out of the house if we have to.
So George has asked me to come in and kind of go over the contract for deed default process, but also comparatively go over the all-inclusive and the lease option default processes. So let's start with the all-inclusive because that's the one most people are familiar with. It's called an all-inclusive trust deed because it includes a trust deed that may have been on the seller's property when they sold it on seller financing. But this would also apply to a normal trust deed where there is not a senior loan. So in the event of a trust deed, you have a foreclosure. That's the correct default process. Now, there are two types of foreclosures typically done in Utah, and I want to make sure you understand we're going to be going over Utah-specific laws. So if you were in a different state, you would want to check with a real estate attorney in your state to find out if it is the same or different. But there are two types of foreclosure in the state of Utah. One is called a judicial foreclosure. That's typically done if there's a mortgage that's done instead of a trust deed, or also in the event there's a trust deed foreclosure that has some additional complications. It's very rare that you would do that, but it is a possibility. But we're going to talk about the one that is done the vast majority of the time, which is the non-judicial foreclosure. The non-judicial foreclosure process in the state of Utah is a 120-day process. So that doesn't mean start to finish it's going to be exactly 120 days. You may have a weekend or a holiday, but in general terms, the minimum time you would expect is 120 days. Now, the first 90 days of that process are called the redemption period. The redemption period means the buyer can pay the amount that is delinquent on the loan and reinstate the loan. So you have that statutory right in the state of Utah. After the 90 days, the lender could actually request the entire amount, whether or not you tender just the amount that's delinquent. So this is the longest time you're going to have on a default process generally because you've given the buyer both title and ownership, which are not the same things. But when they have both, that's the strongest bundle of rights for a buyer, and that's why the courts are going to require a foreclosure process. Next, let's talk about the other end of the spectrum, the lease option. A lease option is a lease with a promise to pay a certain amount for as far as the purchase price once the buyer performs. Now, in this one, unlike these two, there's not a redemptive period. In theory, if you are a day late, the seller or the owner of the property could then start what's called an eviction process. Now, the eviction process generally takes 30 to 45 days. So if we put 30 days here, I would want you to understand that that's going to be also, if you do a foreclosure and the people don't leave, you might have to do an eviction on top of that. So this would be 120 plus 30. And when we get to the contract for deed, it would be that default timeline plus 30 days for the eviction. But with a lease option, the buyer's in the weakest position. And that's typically why we see buyers put down not a lot of money on a lease option. Whereas in the contract for deed and the all-inclusive, they'll put down a much larger down payment as a general rule. Now, the last one we're going to talk about is the contract for deed. And the reason I leave that for last is kind of my bowling analogy. When my kids were young, we'd go bowling and we'd put up the little bumpers on the side. So this is your very strong buyer bumper. This is kind of your very weak buyer bumper. And this is the alley in the middle. And for the sellers, it's kind of beneficial because you generally, again, get 10-15% down payment where you wouldn't expect that on a lease option. But you're looking at a 30-day forfeiture process. Now, the forfeiture process is one where you don't have to file anything as far as on the public record. With a foreclosure, you have to file a notice of default. With a forfeiture, you give notice to the buyer, and it's a specific legal notice. Once they've received that notice, the 30-day timeline begins running. At the end of that 30 days, a final set of legal documents is sent to the buyer in the form of another notice, and then their interest terminates in the contract, and then you could again do the eviction. It's important to understand this from a buyer's perspective as well, and oftentimes we'll recommend to buyers that they put a payment in escrow if they're paying through an escrow company, and that way they don't have to worry about, oh, the bank forgot to make the transfer, something went wrong, and they might lose their interest. So now with that explanation, we'll turn the time over to any questions.
Okay. One question I had on this, Jackson, I guess this is kind of presumed, is that as far as cost, this is probably the most expensive, least expensive, and then again, somewhere in the middle.
That would be correct,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
And especially since the eviction kind of goes on top of these sometimes because the people may not leave the property after the foreclosure or forfeiture. Yes, this would be the least expensive because when you added on to these, it would make it more. But typically a foreclosure, because you have publication expenses, you have filing expenses with the county, is going to be more expensive than a forfeiture for a seller.
Okay. All right. Well, that is excellent information, and I appreciate that, Jax. And thanks again for coming into the creditjungle.com today. Remember, you can push button and you can get mortgage professional and maybe even real estate attorney. But I'll leave that up to Jax. But thanks for visiting today, and you have a great one. We hope to talk with you soon.